Welcome to Three Things I've Learned with your host, Susan Dolci, where we share the stories that shift our souls. In the next hour, we will dive deep into the soul-shifting magic of stories. Stories of radical transformations, courageous breakthroughs, and life lessons. We're all students in this soul school called life. We don't need to do this alone. Why not share our notes? Three Things I've Learned starts now. Hey, welcome everybody to Three Things I've Learned, where we share the stories that shift our souls. I'm your host, Susan Dolci, and once again, I am so grateful for all of you that tune in to listen every other Tuesday here on Transformation Talk Radio. So today, I am joined by my friend, Chaplain Candi. She's been on my show before, so I'm really excited to talk to her again. She's a board-certified Jewish and interreligious chaplain, a spiritual counselor, a transformational healing coach, and a writer who is almost, if not finished, with her first book entitled Moxie, Finding Courage, Strength, Determination, and Love Through Grief. She has a private coaching practice called Sacred Work with Candi, where she creates a divine, sacred experience that allows individuals and families to share their heart, soul, sorrows, and joys, and facilitates meaningful end-of-life conversations, assisting them in the spiritual transformation of life and death. But another, perhaps little-known fact about Chaplain Candi is that she is also a second-generation Holocaust survivor, which is why she's the perfect person to discuss our topic today, which is how to identify and how to heal intergenerational and inherited family trauma, which is a real thing. It's a real thing. Mm-hmm. Welcome, Candi. I am so happy to have you on the show again.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for having me again. And it's a big topic, and I'm ready to jump into it, even with all my angst.
Well, it is a big topic, and I really, as we were talking just before we started, and I'm sure it's emotional. It's an emotional topic, but and we're talking about trauma. I know that there's been like epigenetics. I think they first started talking about in like 1990, but in like the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of new research uncovering the genetic effects of trauma from previous generations. And it's sort of like that skeleton in the closet that you didn't even know was in the closet, right? And unless you have like a really well documented family history, you might not have any idea about the past traumas that are affecting you now or showing up in your life that you aren't even aware of. So with that being said, let's just talk about trauma in general. So how would you define trauma?
I would define trauma as a response to a distressing event. I also would say that it is a place where it is buried, where it's insidious. I'm breaking it down. I could give you a definition that's all over the internet, but I really like to break it down because it's insidious. It's that unsettled feeling. It's often a shame base sort of undercurrent of something happened, but we can't put our finger on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, buried deep. One of the things, and we will, I'll save this till we get to the part about intergenerational trauma, but there's a thing called the cherry blossom experiment that was brought to my attention that talks about how it signifies how deep it can go, that you're just not even aware, because it affects genetics.
So absolutely does. And I will say, and I came up with this, the only place I've ever heard this mentioned about spiritual injuries was with deployed military personnel, and we come back and it is the thing that I talk about in my practice. Spiritual injuries occur from traumatic events, and they are the thing that robs our voice,
Mm.
that deflates our joy, and it keeps us from shining our light. So it's
Yeah.
that affects the human spirit.
Well, so since you brought up spiritual trauma, what like there are all sorts of different kinds of trauma.
Absolutely. And there's this extensive list, that is on the internet, but there's so much more. There's physical, I guess what I would say first, there's acute, there's chronic trauma, there's complex trauma. Okay. There are physical traumas, there are sexual traumas, there are emotional, mental, mental abuse, controlling. There's even community violence. There's racism, there's discrimination, anti-Semitism, attacking. We're going to get into the second generation Holocaust survivor piece, but that attack on somebody's identity. There's gender identity trauma. There's, traumatic grief. So, and I want to add, which we can get into this more later, but there's covert, there's overt, and there's covert trauma.
Okay, do you want to talk about that now? Because I'm
Sure.
curious.
Yeah, overt. There are people who it's directly, it's directly committed.
So
Somebody
it's on purpose, like somebody wants to hurt you.
more
Like
than
a
on purpose. It's openly.
like a rape?
Yes, like a
Okay.
rape. Covert is that sticky, um, under the covers, so to speak.
Mm,
It's the hidden, the secret, covert. It's also the undercurrent of the emotional abuse.
mm, mhm.
Things that are these jabs, bullying can be, oh, I didn't do anything, but yet it's done.
Mhm.
Overt sexual abuse can be overt. There also can be the sexual innuendos that are also covert. There can be financial abuse, financial trauma, that could be overt or covert, something openly happening. Um, Maybe a memory, maybe somebody directly remembers it, but then there's the part that I think is it's all damaging, right? But
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
covert pieces, excuse me, are the pieces we go, what is going on? I can't figure it out. There's something underneath here. The
Mhm.
covert messages. I work with grief and loss,
Mhm.
all of those, and this is what makes it complex and complicated,
Right.
because there are these messages underneath that you go, I heard this, but this is the message I got. So I heard, and I'll talk about this some more later, Gabor Mate. If you've ever heard of him,
I have not.
oh my gosh. So I'll go into this more, but he's a physician
Mhm.
he's from Germany. He was born in Budapest, and he was a product of Germany, Nazi Germany. And
Mm,
I'll say a little more about that, but he talks about how um, the the effect of trauma and the effect of addiction that comes from it. And
mhm.
he talks about how the the parents that can't deal with maybe they grew up with rage or anger
Mm,
in their family, and they don't know how to deal with an angry child.
Hmm.
So they say to the child, the little girl, a 2-year-old who's having a temper tantrum, which is totally okay, right?
Totally normal.
Right, exactly. And says, good girls don't get angry.
Hmm.
But because children can't convert that, right, to what they
Right.
really mean, they get the message. It's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to have my emotions. And it's also good girls who are angry don't get love.
Right. And that is the crux of it right there, because that's what every child is seeking. I'm in this program right now, a parent coaching program, and one of the things I just learned, was sort of funny, because I was listening to an Audible book. It's a discourse by Bruce Lipton, and he was
Mm.
talking about, and it came up, the same video came up in this program that I'm in, but it's how, like, in the first 7 years of life, and even like primarily like birth through 10 months, how we are just our brains are sort of in a theta state, that we're almost in a hypnotic state, and all we're doing is trying to seek safety and security, and at the same time we're observing. So all we're doing is like downloading these programs into our head of how we're supposed to
Right,
act, what
right.
what is acceptable in our families, what we're supposed to do.
Mhm.
And if you have parents that are already dysfunctional or already suffering from traumas that they don't even know, or haven't made um, uh, connections with their past or healed themselves, then these things are getting programmed into these babies and little kids that, I mean, they don't mean any harm. I mean, every parent, I really believe from the bottom of my heart, is really trying to do the best they can for their kids. But it's this subconscious drive that's in control.
Right. And it's transmitted of they do the best they can. Our parents have all done the best they can. And so I talk about this today not to blame or shame anyone because we as a people have not known how to deal with it. We do the very best we can. We do what we were taught often. And yeah, I'm going to share. I don't know if this is a good time to share this. If we're about to go on a break,
we're,
or
we're gonna go we're coming up on a break, so save the juicy stuff. But since we've got like a few minutes, let's just check in and let people know where they can find you.
sure. You can find me on my website, Sacred Work with Candi, sacredworkwithcandi.com.
Candy with an I.
Candi with an I, yes, yes. I'm on YouTube, same name. I'm on Instagram, and I do have a Facebook page as well. And I love the conversation. So this is really near and dear to my heart. I'm
Mhm.
sure we'll talk about it more later, but I've been a hospice chaplain for many, many years and been at the bedside. You can't bury this stuff. It
Well,
will come up.
yeah, and hopefully that's what we're gonna get to at towards the end, is how this all shows up at the end of life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And since you didn't plug it, I'm going to.
Oh,
She
oh,
also has a link on her website if you want to download the first chapter, like a little teaser juicy bit of her book, Moxie. You can get that at her website. If you go over to her menu and click on that, you'll see a tab to go and do that.
because you so graciously did it for me.
I did. I helped. I helped. All
And
right.
I know
But
we're going to cut to break really
yeah.
soon, but it's funny because this is all timely because I do talk about some of this stuff because when somebody dies, we're in that transformational time. We have to heal some of these patterns. We have to, in order to use what our parents, if that's the one we're grieving over, have left us. We have to carry the torch. We have to find a way to carry the torch and stand up inside ourselves.
we owe it to the generations after us to heal.
We do.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
do.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. I'm speaking with Chaplain Candi. We're talking about intergenerational and inherited family traumas, but more importantly, how to heal those traumas. So we will be right back. Welcome back, everybody. Today, I am joined by Chaplain Candi, and we're talking about trauma, specifically inherited trauma, intergenerational trauma, the stuff that epigenetics talks about, and the kinds of traumas that are even cellular based, that we might respond, react to certain things in our environment or certain situations, and we don't know why. Like why might somebody be afraid of flying if they've never flown before? Or just, I mean, there's all sorts of you know um, situations we could talk about, but I think that the science around this now it's fascinating to me, because they are finding out that it does impact um, people on a cellular level, on a genetic level, and then that is passed down to kids, and when they don't even know why they do it. And we were talking about this a little bit in break, and I want to jump ahead to it because this is where we share the stories that shift our souls. Is I remember you telling me a story about some fear that, or something that,
Mm.
some experience that flustered you, and it wasn't until you kind of, like you said, connected the dots and realized that being a second generation Holocaust survivor comes with stuff that you didn't even know that you were getting.
Exactly. Exactly. So before I jump into that, I'm going to just say that, and I was sharing with you this early on, and I think it's really important as we talk about trauma, that coming into this was scary.
Mm.
Not because I'm afraid to go on camera anymore, which is a miracle,
And
uh,
not to talk to me.
and not afraid because I'm afraid to talk to you, but because so much of trauma is about secrets,
Mm.
and it's about the hidden, and it's about the things that we want to go to our grave with, that we want to bury. So I want to say this by saying, it has come to a place, we mentioned my book, it has come for me to a place that the energy of holding back and hiding has become too painful.
Mm.
And so it may be, and if many of you may be facing this as well, but if there's something inside of you that feels really hard to share, um, that's sometimes a related piece about trauma. And for
Mm.
me, if I'm sharing about my family, I want to say, this is my story. This is
Mhm.
my experience. This is how I have become aware of things. And I believe today that it is time to stand up and own that. Um, with that said, and by the way, I will add too, how do I take care of myself when I know I'm going to be faced with it?
Mhm.
And I know that I was going to share some things that were historical. I have on earrings from my aunt.
I
I have
love that.
on, thank you. I have on a pendant that was from my grandmother's. My dad and my stepmom gave it to me. It was 1901 dime. I have on my Jewish star. I have on a little thing that my daughter gave me, a bracelet or a watch. I have my dad's watch sitting here and things from my mom, because I know that it said, there's a quote, I don't remember where it was, but that the voices of the prophets reverberate through time.
Mm. Mm. The voices of the prophets reverberate through time.
And I believe it's
Yeah.
true of our parents, our ancestors, and those that who have gone before us. And there are messages. And when I was doing my graduate work, my first graduate work before seminary in spiritual psychology, I did a lot of work with Holocaust. And I got the message that as much as it was about persecution, alienation, and devastation and destruction, that wasn't the final message, so to speak. We had to come forward. There was something about coming forward with strength and determination
And resiliency.
and resiliency. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll have to remind me your actual question, but I want to say that before I go to that, I mentioned Gabor Mate.
Mm-hmm.
So he is a physician. He's from Budapest, and he relates trauma with illness, and he talks about how our bodies are affected, our immune system, so he talks about his own experience, and I'm going to share this piece because he's
Mm-hmm.
really worth listening to. I hope to get to see him virtually in April this month. He talked about how when he was in 44, when he was born, he's probably 73, 74 now. And he talked about when he was born, Nazi Germans had not taken over Hungary, but it
Mm-hmm.
was happening. And I guess his dad went away like my grandfather did, where to help get out of the country. And he was he was a baby. He was
Yeah.
crying a lot, and his mom didn't know when it was going to actually happen to him. What actually happened to her, where she might be
Right.
taken. And he was crying and crying and crying, and she called the doctor, and the doctor, she said, my baby is just crying, 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 and can you come see him? The doctor says yes, but I want you to know all of our Jewish babies are crying
Mm.
right now. And a little more in the story, the mom doesn't know when she might be taken, gives him the baby to a stranger, and they're apart for a month. The baby doesn't know, he doesn't know, he
Right.
feels abandoned,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he feels like he's not wanted. And he talks about how does, the interviewer at the time says, how does he said, it still affects me today sometimes,
Yeah.
right? And so she asked about that, and so he talks about when you have that kind of trauma, you become a successful doctor, or a successful chaplain or whatever, because you're seeking to be wanted,
Mm.
and you become a workaholic. I don't feel like I did, but he said he did that, because every time someone calls, you want to say yes because
Mm-hmm.
you want to be wanted, right? So that's how those patterns develop.
Well, and that also kind of goes to what I was saying about how again, this is new to me. I mean, I know that the first 3 years of life are, critically important, but how all of our safety and security patterns all start in the first 10 months. So here he is, this infant who's, like you said, all the babies are crying because they're picking up on their mother's nervous system,
Right.
and everybody's nervous, and that's what they're picking up on, and they don't feel safe. And so
Right.
and it just, and then to grow up, I'm sure, he knows the story, but that imprinting is so deep, so deep.
Right. And you don't know what it is.
Right.
Right. So there's something. He talks about, and I know this too, that empty hole place. And this is where addiction comes in. We try to fill the empty hole. Right.
Yeah.
And, my dad, they escaped from Germany. And I know we're going to go on a break here pretty soon. You
That's
just
okay.
tell
We've got a
me.
few more minutes.
But what you just described, it produces these, what we call intangible grief, the lack of safety, the lack of trust in the world. This came up for me when I had a couple of car accidents at my job, my hospice job that I ended up resigning. And I couldn't trust, and I didn't know why. And it came up around the system that it was supposed to be there to protect, but in my cells,
Exactly.
something told me I could not trust the system. Whatever the laws were set up, whatever the protocol was there to take care of me, wasn't going to. I had no idea this was going to pop up for me.
Yeah. And you didn't own that. I mean, that was, again, that was inherited, right? Like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And I actually had to process it and travel it back and go, okay, what is this about? It's big. What is it? Is it family? Yeah. Is it related to my dad? Well, yeah. And then it hit. It was related to Holocaust.
Yeah.
It was about not trusting.
And again, that's why I said, like, if you don't know your family history, I think about this a lot too with adopted kids, because I have a friend who has 2 adopted kids, and some of the behaviors that come up that are totally trauma related from their, youth, from being in
Mhm.
orphanages and stuff. And if you don't have that, where do you even start? It's like, yeah, it's like a needle in a haystack. Yeah.
Well, and you may not have it. And I've heard stories, but I've had to learn to trust my body
Mm.
and my emotions to go, okay, I've heard the story, but what is true for me?
Mm.
What is true for me? Because our bodies know, and our sense
Body
knows,
doesn't lie.
right? And I've been told many years, don't get so emotional,
Mm.
but the truth is, the energy, I feel it in my body. And that's what we can talk about when we come back, because the
Yeah.
transmission, it does come forward.
Yes. Thank you for taking us into break. So when we come back, we're also going to talk about trauma and how this shows up at towards the end of life. I'm talking with Chaplain Candi. We're talking about trauma today. Whew, big topic, more than we'll cover in our hour. But so we're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Hey, everybody, welcome back. You're listening to 3 Things I've Learned. I am Susan Dolci, and I am speaking with Chaplain Candi today. And we have spent the last 45-ish minutes talking about, oh, no, more like 30-ish minutes, talking about trauma, intergenerational trauma, inherited trauma, and just how, the word you chose that you used in the first segment was insidious.
Mhm.
And that it's like it is sort of like the other word, the other thing that I use the word insidious with all the time is water, because water will sneak into the cracks and rot things, and that you don't even, you're not even aware of, because it just goes to the lowest point. And it's kind of like that, it kind of seeps into the crevices of your life, and you're not even aware of how it's driving your decisions and your behaviors and your relationships, and on and on and on. So I loved your story about Gabor Mata. I'm sorry if I screwed that up.
Gabor,
But
Gabor
Gabor,
Mate.
Gabor Mate. Okay. Fascinating,
Mhm.
fascinating story, as well as your own personal story. But one of the things that, and this is where uh, you and your work really now kind of come to the forefront, is how does trauma show up uh, at the end of life, and how does it impact grief and grieving families, and and the ability for I know this is a loaded question,
Mhm.
but the ability for those that are dying to let go.
Loaded, yes. Great. Um, yeah. In my practice now, Susan, I deal a lot with I say death and dying, grief and loss and trauma because I've spent my life, at least the last 35 years of my life, but I feel like most of it trying to connect the dots. And in my work at the bedside at the end of life, there's a multitude of things that happen. Number one, for the patient, that if they have trauma, and many people do, by the time somebody gets to hospice and they're at the end of life, they don't have the majority of capabilities to deal with it, to
Mhm.
express it. So sometimes, often, it will come up in the way of heightened anxiety.
Mm.
There's a term we use in hospice called terminal agitation.
That sounds horrible.
It's horrible. It's horrible. It is horrible. And it's a lot of the things that people wrestle with at the end of life because they've not been dealt with.
Yeah. You know what? You just hit the like, I'm like, that's exactly what my father went through.
I believe it. I believe it. And I think that that is what has prompted me to dive more deeply into this work, to really make sure when I'm working with somebody on grief, which is often our grief is complicated by our childhood experiences. It goes all the way back. It's about the things that are unresolved. It's about the traumas. It's about the known and unknown traumas.
Mhm.
And we do feel it in our body. Um, it's being able to connect, both for the patient and for the family. Because
Mm.
if it's not resolved, if it's not brought to the forefront, and say the patient feels guilty, that's going to make it difficult at the end of life. Okay. There are
Mhm.
no words. And it's also the things that have been held that the family knows it's going to affect relationships.
Mhm.
And I've said it and I'll say it again. We can't bury it. It does come out. It's coming out all through our life. The effects of trauma are coming out. It'll come out as what we call sideways anger,
Mm.
which is sarcasm, which
Yeah.
actually, at the root of that, the actual meaning of it means to tear flesh.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Because I just side note, in my family, like they know I don't get sarcasm half the time because I always feel like it's people trying to be or people saying what they really mean, but cloaking it in humor.
Mhm,
And I don't appreciate that.
mhm.
So, and sometimes I just don't get it. And they'll say something and they're like, Mom, that was sarcasm. So, yeah,
Sheldon's
I
known for that too,
yeah,
right?
yeah, I can totally appreciate that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm like, let's be literal. Let's tell the truth here.
Yeah.
So you asked me even how does this show up? So I want to dive in a little bit in that too, because it's um, for me in my family. I had well, I want to just say this that first before I share this that things can show up from a child's a parent's divorce. My parents divorced when I was 9, almost 10. I've been working with that all my life, the different effects. If there's a family that has infidelity, that's secret. Um, if a family there's addiction,
Mm.
that and the trying to keep that secret. So there are a multitude of ways, the whole piece around sexual abuse and the coercive, no, the really covert, like this is about love and it's not about love, and and the threats that go with that. So
Mhm.
there's just a multitude. And by the way, the pieces of like sexual shame can come up around um, other person's behaviors,
Mhm. Yep.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and so um, that's confusing too, right? So the
Yeah.
confusing messages that happen along the way. So you asked me, so the Looking Good family, let me
Mhm.
just share about that while we're going here. Because I'm, because of the nature of the Holocaust, we're going to say it like that. The rejection of an identity, an ethnicity, the blame on the Jews for all of life, what was happening.
Mhm.
My dad never talked about it. Okay, never talked about it. Later, there were some stories written, and then I've heard different things, but he never talked about it. So, but that doesn't mean that the energy wasn't transmitted. I can
Mhm.
only imagine the fears that he attempted to bury. He did a great job. He was very successful. I'm very proud of him in the way of being the remarkable man that he was in his work as a hospital administrator and in community, powerful. And at the same time, the pushing down, what I imagine is pushing down fears, those get transmitted. They get transmitted in energy.
Mhm.
They get transmitted in, anger. And I was afraid. I was afraid, and I thought it was my fault. And what happens in families, I say we were looking good family. There's no crime in looking good. That's not what I mean. It's when you feel like you need to put forth an image that's different than the one you actually have, the truth of who you are, because you want to put forth an image so that you will be valued, in fear that you won't be valued
Right.
for who you are. And that's what I feel like has been transmitted.
And that's that mm, the to think about not being able to be authentic, to not being able to show up, in as who you really are, and expressing all all of your God-given qualities, or just to just be who you are, because that's not acceptable, or wasn't acceptable, or was an atrocity. um it's it's just breaks my heart to really put it all together like that. It's just, I mean, and I can see how that is going to be carried over from generation to generation to generation.
Yeah. And so I'm a second generation Holocaust survivor, but there's also third and fourth, and we know very little. We don't know how the effects are. And I can pretty well um, guarantee that if we don't work on our trauma, it is transmitted. But I can also guarantee that if we work on our trauma and if we own it, we can change the trajectory of our family experiences. We can heal the world. We can.
And that's a perfect place to segue into a break, because when we come back, we can talk about how do we begin to heal those? Where do we start? What do we do? What does it look like? I'm Susan Dolci. You're listening to Three Things I've Learned. Today I'm talking with, pardon me, Chaplain Candi, and we're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Okay, we are back. We are talking today about trauma. I'm speaking with Chaplain Candi Warman. And before break, we were talking about the Looking Good family. But right before the break, I said, okay, so now we know trauma. We've talked about it a lot. We understand that it's insidious and that it kind of creeps into, the crevices and the dark spots in our life and kind of, makes a home there. And how do we begin to heal traumas? First of all, we have to identify them. So how do I identify them? How do we heal them? And then lastly, because I want to make sure we get this in the final parts, because you did say, like you said, you're wearing, all of these tokens, all of these memories from family to kind of be around you today as we talk about this. And how can we reach out to, our beloved ones who have crossed over to help us in the healing?
Wow. All in 10 minutes. Wow.
Yeah. Okay, just hit the highlights. You just give me the
Okay,
parts you want to
let me
talk
see
about.
if I can hit the highlights. Whew, how do we heal it? Let's start there. Well, we start talking.
Yeah, name it to tame it, right? Sort of.
We got to start talking. So if you're feeling something weird in your body, if you're feeling something that feels confusing, you're trying to sort it out, if you have family members, talk to them. Work with me to kind of connect so that we can tune in to a truth within your body. As we said earlier, the body doesn't lie.
Mm-hmm.
The body does not lie. The emotion, if I'm shocked by something that happens or something makes me feel sick inside, there's something there for me.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden I walk into a room, I get a headache. That's an indication something is going on. So we need to start paying attention to what our body's doing.
Which I'm interrupting here really briefly, which I bet is really hard for a lot of people because most people aren't even in their bodies.
Well,
They're in
exactly.
their heads.
Yeah, but I want to say this, a couple of quick things that really have hit me, like recognizing when my mom was, she was afraid of being abandoned. She was
Mm.
afraid that when I would leave home, I was mm, that, I was abandoning her. This was a theme that came up. And then when I studied further and did a genogram when I was in grad school, and I was asking my mom some questions, and she ultimately came out with that her the story about her mom being afraid that um, that when they moved to New Orleans, that her husband was going to abandon her, was going to leave.
Mm.
She says, why? And mom was 18. And she says, all of a sudden the story came out here. My mom was 18, but it came out that when her mom, so my grandmother's mom, was 30 and there were 6 kids, her father walked out, was a
Yeah.
womanizer, was, abandoned. Well, we didn't know we needed to talk about this stuff.
Right.
And I'm going, oh my gosh, that explained everything.
Yeah.
Did I judge my mom? I'm sure I've judged my mom on other occasions, but this was like, wow, this makes sense of how the fear of abandonment gets transmitted. The other thing I want to share that I became aware of in this grief group was how when my parents divorced, I couldn't, I only knew what I knew. There were pieces that weren't identified, stories I heard later, but I had to realize later that I held back my love because I didn't know my love was good enough. I was afraid I might be abandoned, even though I knew my dad didn't abandon me per se, that he left my mom, but he really left us. He left the family, and so I was fearful of that. And I also didn't know that my love was enough. So these are things that happen from trauma.
Yeah.
So how do we heal?
How do we heal?
How do we continue to heal? So we have to recognize that we are multi-dimensional beings. We are not just physical. We are not just spiritual. We are connected. All right. We need to be connected. We need to honor all of ourselves. And we need to feel this stuff. Okay. We need to pay attention if we get headaches or we get stomach aches or we get nausea. So we have to get connected to the body. Sometimes it's through meditation. Becoming educated on what trauma is huge. Because so often we want to go, it wasn't so bad.
Yeah,
I
downplay
survived.
it. Yeah.
I survived. We want to minimize. Okay. We've been minimized often, and we minimize ourselves. Okay. So we have to feel it, connect with it, connecting with our spirits, and knowing that these idiosyncrasies that we have, there's something connected to that. We need to break the cycles.
Yeah, we need to be curious with self-compassion and self-love. And it's like, yeah. And
Right.
and try to come from a place of non-judgment. And I mean, it's this stuff is, again, we're coming up at the top of the hour, and we could, as always, when Candi and I get on a show together, we could do 3 hours talking about what we want to talk about. But yes, I mean, it's thank you for sharing your personal story. Thank you for being brave and authentic and coming on here to talk about trauma and how it's shown up in your life and how we can try to heal ourselves and, identify it and heal the trauma in our lives so that hopefully we don't pass it on to the next generation.
Right. And if I can wrap up by saying this, the breaking of the cycles is all about the racism, the dehumanization, the abuse cycles, the anti-Semitism, all of it, the disconnections that we feel. And when we start paying attention, we can build that connection. We can heal. We can heal ourselves. We can heal our families, and we can heal the world.
And so if you'd like to work with Candi, because she's great at all of this healing stuff, she's great at trauma and grief, and she's a master and a wizard, and I adore her. Her website is Sacred Work with Candi. That's Candi with an I, sacredworkwithcandi.com. We all have a story to tell. We can live in the story, or we can transform the story. It's your choice. But if you change your story, you can change our world. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to 3 Things I've Learned with Susan Dolci. Tune in every first and third Tuesday at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern on transformationtalkradio.com for more inspiring stories of radical transformations, courageous breakthroughs, and life lessons. For more information on Susan and the stories that shift our souls, visit her at susandolci.com. That's susandolci.com. DOLCI. We'll see you next time.